One of the most important things that I learned while doing interdisciplinary studies is the importance of considering the appropriateness of a particular method to studying a particular subject. So it's a really simple idea, but I think it's one that tends to be overlooked within disciplines which tend to be more focused on refining their own methods rather than learning how to navigate different methodologies in order to address a particular complex problem. And the incredible impact that just a basic change in orientation can have was really brought home to me through the work of Collingwood. And basically, it was a simple idea, again, but it was one that really struck me. And he was interested in studying history, and he had observed that in the 17th and 18th centuries, physics had kind of won the day in terms of having a method that really lined up with its particular object of inquiry. And that rather than being motivated to find and refine their own methodologies, disciplines tried to benefit from the success of physics by appropriating its methods and applying them to their own their own subject matter. So we often have the caricature of studying history or human nature in terms of cause and effect, and that this appropriation or application of physics didn't really get the same results that the physicists got. So the extension of these techniques kind of lost its explanatory force when it was extended beyond its scope. And some people interpreted the failure for physics to illuminate other subjects as an indication that it's impossible to know anything about these other things. We can't ever really know history. We can't understand or have any sort of insight into human nature. But some of the more moderate voices, Collingwood sort of being representative of those, said, well, I don't think it's really precise to conclude in light of this failure that something's impossible. It's not precise, it's not accurate. All we can really accurately conclude is that a particular method failed to illuminate our subject matter. And the sort of catchphrase that I gleaned from Collingwood's approach to this failure was that it's not rational to conclude on the basis of a failed method that something's impossible. So in the face of failure, all we can conclude is that a particular method didn't do what we set out for it to do. It could be that it's impossible, it could be that the method is never going to get the results we want, and it could also be that we need to try another more appropriate methodology. And whenever I sort of engage in discussions where there's a lot of controversy, one of the other considerations that I bring to bear is whether or not the discussions open up and raise new questions. So this is an interview between Gilles Deleuze and Foucault, and basically some of the insights that were addressed in that discussion were about the relationship between theory and power. And that while power has a tendency to totalize, theory has a tendency to multiply, to have a proliferation of meaning, to raise new questions, to admit new possibilities, rather than to impose some sort of foreclosure, the failure to admit anomalies, the failure to admit difference. So bringing these two questions to bear, I want to sort of tackle a contentious issue in the health sciences, and I'll just also make a point that of all places I expect this sort of open, reasonable discourse in the health sciences, because we are dealing with complex issues, we're dealing with life, we're dealing about how we might be able to intervene in living processes in order to get some sort of remediation. So this is the place where I think it's really important to have some sort of open discussion that challenges the power structures rather than enforces them. And this is where I find it to be sorely lacking. So I'm going to launch right into a really contentious subject, which is the biochemical impossibility of homeopathy. And for those of you who aren't familiar, historically homeopathic remedies were developed by through a series of dilution and succussion and basically preparing remedies beyond the point of it being possible for a single trace of the original substance to be in the final mixture. So in chemistry, we have this thing called Avogadro's number, which says that any dilution beyond the point of 10 to the exponent negative 24 can't possibly have any trace of the molecule in the original substance. So to say that these remedies prepared in this way could possibly have biochemical effect is to just kind of catch yourself in saying something that's a contradiction. And in response to this failure, we have the charge against people who actually go out and use these remedies that it's impossible for homeopathic remedies to have any effect beyond placebo. And I just want to kind of unpack this a bit, because this is a heavy charge. A lot of ethical considerations are wrapped up in this allegation. And the first thing that I kind of want to draw attention to is the claim of impossibility. So going back to the earlier slide, whenever we see a claim of impossibility, to me this doesn't say anything about the efficacy of homeopathy. What this is an indication of is the constraints that are left unstated in this particular discourse. So I would say, in order to add precision to this discussion, we would have to revise this to say that it is impossible for the mechanism of homeopathy to be accounted for in biochemical terms. And now, if we have a precise claim, then we can bring into question the terms of the discussion and ask, are these appropriate terms? On what basis am I expected to give my explanation in the terms that it's demanded? And the other thing that I want to point out is this gesture towards a placebo effect. So on the one hand, we have constraints that I think are understandable. We expect to understand this within biochemical paradigm. But then we also see an imposition of restraints on everything that falls outside of that. So because homeopathic remedies and placebo effect both have mechanisms that are not biochemical, they're the same thing. So this is, I think, a totalizing tendency not only within a particular paradigm, but for everything that falls outside of it. And I think, through my own studies of philosophy and science, I think anytime you see this sort of broad category that we put all mystery in, it's an indication that we have some sort of reductionistic model at play. So we're going to reduce the phenomena to a particular term and not admit any mystery that falls outside of that. Rather than, I think an alternative would be, to actually go in and try to understand those mechanisms in their own terms. So, with this gesture to a placebo effect, we see how the charge against the homeopathic community is one that not only says what you're doing is not effective, saying what you're doing is not ethical. Because placebo, I think from either perspective, be it biomedical or homeopathic, is just a shoddy basis of medicine. We can't, predict anything with accuracy. People are expected to be open to it working. We have these bizarre questions of what about animals and babies? Can placebo effect happen to them? And I think all of these concerns are legitimate and are founded. And I guess my response would be, I think that in order to levy these whether you're the one leveling these criticisms or you're the one expected to account for them, the mechanism at play in question has to be understood. But if we don't just unquestioningly accept the terms of the discussion, but we actually say, hey, just because I've been educated and medicated and vaccinated into a particular context doesn't mean I have to unquestioningly accept it. And if we open it up and say, well, in the face of failure, in the face of the biochemical impossibility of homeopathy, is there another method for possibly understanding its mechanism of action? And in order to have some sort of even-footed discussion and not just some arbitrary attempt to claim any shape into the box, as long as it fits, then we have to justify our methods and consider their commensurability. And I think there is an alternative. And the most compelling alternative that I found is biosemiotics. And basically, the central insight of biosemiotics is that living processes can best be understood as an interaction of messages, as an exchange of information, translation of different codes, rather than the interaction between mechanical bodies. And from biosemiotician point of view, biochemistry is the sort of practice of taking a method that was developed to study inorganic substances and applying it to living processes, and that this application is going to bring new insights to bear, but it also has its own limitations packed into it, just because it wasn't specifically developed as a method to study this biological phenomenon. And biosemiotics as a discipline developed alongside the idea or development of biological information in molecular biology. So basically, with this insight that a particular sequence of nucleotides actually has an impact on a sequence of amino acids that make up a protein, we had this shift in biology from an energy-based science to an information-based science. And with this shift, there were different responses to this idea of biological information. The predominant response is to say it's a metaphor. Biological information is a shorthand that we use to explain processes that we can understand in biochemical terms, but that, just for the ease of understanding, we're just going to group that off and say, and this is when, biological information process takes place, but that it's not actually a different mechanism at play. And this is the predominant response, and it's called the physicalist thesis. And I think conceptually, it's really similar, if not identical, to a placebo effect, in the sense that it's cordoning off the mystery, the mechanism that we don't understand, and saying, well, we're not going to admit this into the confines of our discussion. We'll gesture and acknowledge that it's at play and it's operative, but for the purposes of our science, we can't possibly admit this. And the other response that sort of gave rise to biosemiotics as a discipline is that the exchange of biological information is a real thing, that it's a real process that can be understood, and that when we first recognized that a particular sequence, spat out a particular biochemical entity, that what we were engaged in that observation was semiosis. So we were understanding this in terms of translation of information, and that this capacity to study phenomena in this way is what would allow us to confirm our understanding of evolution as we know it, to understand inheritance, and all of these other theories that were sort of at play at the time that this discovery was made. So biosemioticians are reluctant to impose any sort of reductionistic models to understand life, because they say life is a pretty complex thing to study, and that it spans across many different levels. So from macromolecules all the way up to entire populations, we have different processes at play, and that in order to understand how they interact, we have to engage in different techniques. So if we want to understand how the lower levels, for example, the chemical level, gives rise to and forms the constituent parts of the other levels, then it makes good sense to apply the laws of chemistry to understand that process. But if we want to understand the way that the biological processes that emerged from this chemical realm in turn inform and determine the constraints of the chemical processes, then we have to employ completely different methods of analysis. Semiotics. So just to kind of outline in a sort of basic way the difference in terms of analysis, if I were to interpret these two words, well, I wouldn't call them words, if I were to interpret these two things in quantitative terms, in terms of its constituent parts, to understand what's making it up, it would be pretty difficult for me to distinguish between the two. I would say, well, they're made up of the same constituent parts. They're kind of in the same order. Maybe I'm looking at one, maybe it's my vantage point, maybe this is some sort of quantum physics thing. But the point is that in order to recognize that one of these entities has meaning that conveys a dog, and the other has meaning that conveys a god, we have to employ completely different tools of analysis. And it's because semiotics is just something that we tap into so readily, it's not always easy to detect when we're making that shift. But that is an important one to note. And that there's a world of difference between a dog and a god who must be responsible for the placebo effect, because I don't know how else to account for that mystery. And sort of the work that I'm interested in doing is to go and look at some of the studies that have been done to understand the mechanism of homeopathic remedies in light of this distinction between, chemistry and semiotics, and to ascertain at every step which mode are we in, what method of analysis is called for here. And some of the most seminal work has been done by Jacques Benveniste, who had nothing to do with the homeopathic community. He was a pretty respected scientist before he dared to sort of slip into that community, and was responsible mostly for developing methods to understand immune response. So working with different allergens and seeing how they can get some sort of histamine response from white blood cells. So he was trying to do studies to see how little of a trace of a substance can be used to get a biological response by getting the placebo out of there by just looking at it at a cellular level. And one of his lab partners was an MD who had this side interest in homeopathy. And he said, well, why don't we test these, potentized, can't possibly have biochemical effect remedies on your basophil granulators, which was a fancy word for his test. And he said, well, it's just water, but go for it. And after 5 years of doing these studies, Benveniste was like, okay, I think we have a basis to at least call for a new study. And he called for a retrial, like let's redefine the terms of this experiment. And after 2 years, seeing that even though they were diluted, they had effect, he called for it to be done and replicated by different labs in different countries. So 6 different labs in 4 different countries came together, co-authored an article that was published in Nature Journal. And the editors couldn't find faults with the standard acceptable method that he was supposed to follow in order to publish this article, but it was still contentious and it was violating accepted physical laws or understandings. And one of the sort of 2 different experiments that he set up to try to understand, because all he was seeing was that it was having an effect. He still didn't have any insight into its mechanism. But just, well, we know it's not biochemical, we know that we can actually verify these results, we still don't know what's going on. And he had two different ways of diluting. One was through just extracting a drop, putting it into another substance, and not actually shaking it in the intervals. And the other was to follow the procedure that homeopaths would be more comfortable with, which involves shaking between each dilution. And he noticed that when he was just taking the substance, then, you wouldn't get any sort of immune reaction, you wouldn't see any sort of biological change. But that when you were going through this process of agitating substances between each subsequent dilution that you were. And again, this isn't really providing insight into the mechanism. All this is saying is, well, maybe it's not arbitrary that this method is used. And then, the unfortunate talk of water memory theory came out of this, which is, I think, just some sort of hypothesis to understand, well, we know it's not biochemical, mechanism, but we can sort of verify and create experiments that are falsifiable to say, well, something still is going on. what sort of hypothesis can we have to say, to explain how this information is being exchanged? Maybe, as a hypothesis, water can keep imprints of these substances and that it's retained. And this has gone off and has a life of its own, is appropriated by any imaginable New Age community to account for, you know, the importance of meditation, you name it. But why I think it's important to actually approach this issue with a biosemiotic lens is to recognize that while I actually think this is really funny, it misses the mark. This sort of analysis of what's going on would be comparable to going back to the dog and the god and saying, well, how is it possible that these different impressions are on the paper? And sure, I think it's a legitimate question to say, okay, well, how are the media through which we exchange information operative? And I think it's an important question, and I think it's open, and that it raises new questions, and it calls for new experiments. But if you return to Benvenist's studies, you would say that when he was following this idea of it being the transmission of information, he wasn't stuck on a particular method. He wasn't stuck, he wasn't a homeopath, he wasn't saying we have to follow this way of remedying substances. So he went well beyond it. He was like, wow, what other ways can we, you know, present information to elicit biological change? And those are the studies that I don't think have gotten adequate attention, and that I think sort of deserve it. And going back to what I said earlier, I think when we're going to decide what sort of studies are legitimate and what sort of questions are relevant, we have to remind ourselves of what sort of impetus we have. Do we just have this wonder, and do we just want to understand and prove or disprove that water can actually retain certain structures? And what jurisdiction would that question fall into, and what would its relevance be? And from my perspective, because my main interest in this is from health science, life science perspective, is to understand the mechanism. To say, okay, well, if we see that this is a different process, if we can say maybe this is the exchange of information rather than the exchange of particles, what tools have been developed in these sciences that are actually relevant and applicable to understanding living processes? Because even though the findings of Benveniste were controversial, the fact that they were relevant and that they had huge impact on our understanding of health and remediation was not. And then lastly, the final thing that I think is worth noting, and I did this as a motivational poster because every time I say this point, I just feel like I'm, you know, on Oprah saying, never give up. But I'm not. Maybe it's just a point of precision. And I think it bears repeating. I think, you know, if you have no interest in homeopathy or anything, that this, I think, would be worthwhile if you just got this single thing out of it, which is that it's not rational to conclude on the basis of a failed method that something's impossible. This is an indication that we are overstepping reason, that reason is overextending itself. And here we have more of a totalizing tendency, which I think is more representative of power structures than of true theory, which at its best is supposed to keep power in check. It's supposed to challenge it, it's supposed to undermine it, rather than just imposing it because it's the status quo, because it's the hegemonic discourse. So for no other reason, I think it's important to raise these new questions and not get tied down or bogged down in any capacity by the power structures that are at play, but rather taking a step back, trying to be objective, because I think we all have an interest in the answers to these questions. So, thanks.